Steve says, I find myself agreeing with much of Aristotle's thoughts on ethics. I wish I was exposed to these when I was younger. Don't we all? Although it's interesting because, so I mean, I was exposed to Aristotle as an undergraduate, and I mistakenly thought that Aristotle wasn't saying anything really interesting. So I wasn't in a proper condition myself to make use of what I was getting from Aristotle until really in graduate school. But assuming that you had your head on better than I did as a younger person, maybe encountering Aristotle earlier on would be helpful. And I will say something that Alistair McIntyre, he's got a piece called Plain Persons and Moral Philosophy that when I teach an ethics class, I often begin with that. And he makes the point that you can't just like go to young people and say, "Here you go. Here's Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Go forth and prosper, young person." You got to do a lot of unpacking and explaining, and back and forth dialogue and stuff like that, because you look at what Aristotle's saying. It's not in a form that I think most young people. McIntyre was saying this back in like the 1980s, I think, or 1990s. It's even more so for today. It would be hard to just throw Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics into the lap of a young person and say, now you've got the blueprint for how to behave. But they're certainly better off encountering Aristotle or Plato or the Stoics than not, right? And for a lot of us, this is not stuff that we get in our kindergarten through 12th grade. And if we get it in college, it's usually in the context of an ethics class or an intro to philosophy class. And it's, maybe it's taught well, maybe it's not. I mean, my teachers were pretty terrible as an undergraduate. So that's, yeah, I mean, I agree with you too on that. Steve, does Aristotle equate virtue with goodness, or is goodness something different for him? Neither. Um, it's better to view virtue as a main kind of goodness. It is not the only kind of goodness, but it is among the most important kinds of goodness, and it's certainly the one that makes other good things for us human beings work right. So what do I mean by that? There's really two things to say. So Aristotle distinguishes pretty consistently in his works between different types of goodness and correspondingly badness, right? So for example, in Nicomachean Ethics Book 1, he's going to distinguish between good as being like just and unjust. So that's one modality. We can call it beautiful or fine or honorable, the kalon, and the shameful, the eistron. Not the same thing as justice and injustice, although there sometimes is overlap. The useful, the sumpheron, and the harmful, the blaberon. Notice we've already got like three different things going on here, and none of them are reducible to each other. And then we have the pleasurable and the painful. Aristotle considers pleasure to be a good, pain to be a bad, but that's yet another modality of goodness and badness. And we can also use sort of a generic term, agathon for goods, all these kinds of goods, and kakon for bads. And then we can talk not just about these values or modalities, we can talk about actual things like wealth is a useful good, right? Wealth is not a pleasant good unless you're like super into wealth and that makes you feel good to have money in the bank. Then there's useful goods, and then other useful goods. Then there's pleasant goods, and then there's things that are noble, and virtue figures into that. Virtue also, as we're going to see when we talk about this in 2 weeks, makes us just, because justice as a whole includes the virtues. As a matter of fact, you can think of justice as complete virtue. That's one of the many different kinds of virtue. So Aristotle doesn't equate virtue with goodness, but virtue is among the main goods for human beings and human life. Not so much unless we're using virtue in an extenuated sense for, say, animals or plants or stuff like that. But moral virtues are actually good for us, and they make us good. Goodness is not something different from virtue because it includes virtue, but goodness includes a lot of other kinds of good. So, pleasant experiences. As we're going to talk about here, honor is a good thing according to Aristotle as well. So that's a good question, important clarification to make. Any other? So Nicole has a good question here. How would somebody move towards claiming enough or claiming less if they're claiming more? So if the person is claiming more too much, right? Perhaps, and then how do they move towards claiming less or claiming the right amount? Well, that's a good question. So this is where I would say this is where we have to go beyond Aristotle's text to some degree, because if you think back to our first week, like how do we become virtuous? Aristotle says that a lot of it is through habituation. Now, habituation in a lot of cases is going to be like rehabituation, because if we're already this person that Nicole's bringing up, hypothetically, maybe they're a little bit foolish or vain and we want to bring them back to a right recognition of what it is that they actually deserve. That's not going to happen through them just like reading a book or having somebody say in their coaching session, you need to do this. It's going to take like rethinking it, approaching these sorts of things in situation after situation. It'll probably also require some role modeling, where you look at people who are genuinely great souled and you say, how is what they're doing different than what you're doing, and how do you move towards that? And perhaps with some of the criteria that Aristotle is providing us, you could do this cognitively as well. You could say, well, here's a great example. So in quite a few families in our present day, there may be some people who are given greater respect or deference or whatever we want to call it, greater status within the family than they actually deserve. And then there's other people who get less. If you're that person who's getting more than you actually deserve, you could, in fact, think to yourself, why is it that, my relatives are always treating me as the golden child, right? Wow, look at this. They went and ran at a track meet. Oh, this is so amazing. Whereas like, uh, Jimmy or Jenny over there is just like won a scholarship to Yale and they're not being celebrated, right? You could like look at that and be like, things are screwed up here. I need to figure out how I myself am not just going to bask in their adulation, but I'm going to demand the right amount and maybe like shift some of my honor that I'm getting to my siblings who are more squared away than I am. So there's a lot of ways I think that one could do this. Let's hold on to that, and maybe we'll come back to that in a bit, because I think there could be other ways that could be quite helpful as well. All right, so here's a good question from David where we're getting a little bit more specific. Would the magnanimous person wait to be asked for their loves or hates, or would they actively look for ways to share their opinions? So that's, I don't think that they would actively look for ways to share their opinions unless they were like in a crisis and they wanted to use that opportunity to like really take a stand. So if somebody is like, this politician who is our governor or senator, or this person who's in charge of our organization, or this person who's our CEO is really screwing up, I'm gonna take a stand and do so deliberately. I think that would be possible, but those will be extraordinary circumstances. I don't think that they'll always wait to be asked, um, but they're probably going to be more reticent to come right out about it. I mean, they're not going to like, stop a meeting to say, I think that's BS, or this is really awesome, I think they're going to be, we could say, I think they're going to be strategic in their public revelations of their loves and hates. A great example of this is somebody who I would say is magnanimous in this way is Alistair McIntyre. If you don't know who he is, he's a very important 20th and 21st century virtue ethics philosopher who started out being analytically trained and as a Marxist, made his way as a cultural critic, eventually became an Aristotelian, and then, sort of a more robust version of that in what we call Aristotelian Thomism. And I was fortunate enough to be in a faculty fellowship over the summer with Alistair McIntyre in 2005 at Notre Dame University. And I was probably the most junior scholar selected for that. And, we got to interact quite a bit. And he and I would have conversations once in a while. I would see him at conferences, and he was not what you would call a respecter of persons, meaning that he didn't like only hang out with the big shots. He would hang out with nobodies like me. And he'd come up and he'd be like, how are your wife and kids, and what are you working on right now? And he wrote a letter of recommendation for me that was very helpful in looking for jobs. And that's the kind of guy that he is. He walks the walk of virtue ethics. And another great example of how he was magnanimous as a teacher when he was at Notre Dame before he retired. I mean, he's in his 90s now. He could have only taught graduate students or not even taught anybody. He could have just done research and talks and stuff like that. Instead, he chose to teach undergraduates in basic classes like Intro to Philosophy. And why did he do that? He said, well, they deserve a good education too. And they're where, we have the greatest opportunity to do some good. Graduate students are easy to teach, undergraduates, much more difficult to teach. And I looked at that and I was like, wow, that's a guy who really follows his principles. Now, the frankness of speech. So McIntyre talks about, there's a phrase in After Virtue, Saint Benedict, right? And it got turned into this thing called the Benedict option by a guy named Rod Dreher, and advocated by a lot of cultural conservatives. And McIntyre took the opportunity in one of his recent addresses to say, people have tried to claim that I'm putting forth something like that, and this is directly opposed to what I'm actually teaching. So he was showing his in Aristotelian terms, his hatred very publicly, but doing so strategically. So I think to finish David's question, it's really going to depend on the situation that the magnanimous is in. They're not going to be like, the person who's just waiting for the conversation to have a lull in it so they can like put their own thing in there. They're not looking for that kind of social status. So that's an important consideration. Steve says, why does Aristotle say smallness of soul is worse than vanity? At least that's my translation, second to last sentence of chapter 3. Well, let's take a look at that, because that doesn't sound quite right. He probably says worse in some respect, right? So what I have here is smallness of soul is more opposed than vanity to greatness of soul, being both more prevalent and worse. So let's see what the Greek is here. Antithetai, so opposed. Dete megala psychia he micropsychia malon tes chauno teto. So that's right there. Kai gar gignitai malon, it happens more often. kai heron estin. I mean, it could be worse. Heron can also be lesser. So it's kind of a translator's choice, I would say there. But I don't think it's conveying that as a disposition. It's actually like more vicious. It's not kakistos, So yeah. But what's his reasoning there? Maybe it deviates more from greatness of soul than vanity does. The vain person is it's sort of like the rash person with courage and then cowardice, right? The rash person is also a screw up, just like the coward is, but it looks more similar to the virtue. So George says, I do see myself as small souled. I usually shoot myself down over certain skills, which is bad because this judgment becomes internalized to who I am, but it is overall mistaken. Yeah, it is bad for you overall and as a pattern. And it eventually becomes part of your mindset. So you start out by like being self-deprecating, and then eventually you do think of yourself that way, right? That can happen. So he says, I've gotten a good grade in philosophy courses. Students in my classes have asked me questions over something they're confused about, but nevertheless, I don't see myself as capable of performing well in philosophy. Last semester, I did a paper for my gender in sociology class. And as soon as I turned it in, for some reason, I thought I was going to fail. I started thinking of all the consequences of failing and internalizing them, but I actually did pretty well. Fear has a big role to play here, and fear can override reasonable counter arguments against it. I guess I have to train myself against fear. So a lot of different things going on there. Aristotle doesn't talk about fear in this section, but I think what George is bringing up, which is an experience that I think many of us have had in one way or another. It could be about education. It could be about our job prospects. I'll tell you that one thing that took a lot of work on my part when I first started working with clients, and having to be a marketer and close deals, is the reluctance to ask people for money, right? Because you don't want to get to that point where they're going to turn you down, or try to, can't you do it for cheaper or something like that? So sometimes you don't talk about it at all, right? And you let them bring it up, in which case sometimes they never bring it up. It requires overcoming that fear. And what is the fear of? The fear is of, what we talked about a little bit earlier, this being refuted or being revealed as not being as good as you're presenting yourself as being. In the case of like dealing with clients, maybe my services are not worth the money that I'm asking for, right? And they'll say, screw you, I'm not going to give it to you. Maybe in the case of a paper, you're handing it in and your worry is they're going to see that I'm a fraud and I don't know what I'm talking about. They're going to give me an F, and it'll have a big F on it, and they'll hand it to me in front of the whole class. They don't do that really anymore, but or at least they shouldn't, because that's kind of a jerk thing to do. And we could talk about this in many other forms. So if you think of yourself as small souled, and this kind of goes back to the question that I think it might have been Nicole asked earlier. Yeah, how does somebody move towards claiming the right amount? So if you're small souled, then like you said, training yourself, how do you move yourself to the middle position where you are in fact demanding, expecting, rightly assessing what you're worth, what your value is. It takes a lot of work, and you might have to do cognitive exercises. Like, it's good that you've identified that fear is a factor there, and you can do exercises. Aristotle doesn't give you exercises, but you could do exercises like those in other philosophies of life, and look at your fears and unravel them cognitively and figure out whether they're reasonable fears or not. Right. So that's a great point. Uh, So now, to answer Nicole's question, let's talk about this fourth possibility. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, the person who's worthy of little and claims little, Aristotle says, is temperate, sophron. And he also says something else that's kind of funny. He says that it's like a small person who can't really be attractive, a person with a small body. They can't really be attractive in a full sense because that involves largeness. Now, I don't know about this. This doesn't even seem like culturally conditioned. This seems like Aristotle thinks that bigger people are more attractive. Now we know that there's some things to this, right? If you're tall, I've been fortunate enough to enjoy what we could call tall privilege. It turns out that being tall puts you at certain advantages for things, but does it actually make you more attractive? I don't know about that. So, Aristotle's saying this is not a great disposition, but it's okay to have. In the Eudemian ethics, where he does not, by the way, talk about right ambition, he says that there are small things that a person may deserve and claim things of the size. This person is not reprehensible. They're not bad. And they're also not the opposite of the great-souled person. The small-souled person is the opposite. They're at a vice end, right? The vain person is at another opposite. This person, so like what Nicole was asking, what's the difference between the small-souled person and humbleness? The humble person realizes that they don't deserve a lot and they don't demand a lot as a result. They know their value. They're not lacking self-knowledge, you could say. Whereas the small-souled person really does deserve more than they're claiming. And they're maybe putting themselves down, or they are, as George was saying, driven by fear, or, Aristotle would say, they just don't know their own value. And so there's a difference between these two kinds of dispositions. Now, interestingly, this nameless value, right ambition, as we're calling it, it's discussed in the Nicomachean Ethics briefly, but not at great length. And it's not discussed in the Eudemian Ethics at all. In the Nicomachean Ethics, this middle state is, as Aristotle says, nameless. So why is it nameless? Well, people know the extremes, but there's no name for the right mean. And Aristotle says there is a mean when it comes to this that causes us to be rightly disposed, diathethetai, towards moderate and small honors. And what are moderate and small honors? Like people remembering our birthday, or giving us congratulations about a job that we got, or pick whatever else you want to say. And he says that we can desire, in Greek, or it's sometimes translated as pursue, honor more or less than is right? Failure from the right or wrong sources, hothen, which could be the right or wrong people, but also the right or wrong reasons, and in the right or wrong ways, hos in Greek, right? And he says that on the two extremes, we have two terms. We have the ambitious person, the philotimos, the lover of honor, right? And we criticize a person for being ambitious if they seek honor more than is right or from the wrong sources. So the people who are constantly trying to, increase their social media presence, but they don't really have much to say, or the people who are always trying to be a big shot at work, but they don't really pull their load, And then he says, likewise, a person gets criticized as being unambitious when they don't care, is how it's translated here. But the Greek for that is actually oud proairumenon. And so it's coming from that proairesis. They don't prioritize, you could say, being honored, even for things that are good, even for things that are beautiful or noble, epitois kalois. So, like if you are a good musician and, you're at a party and people are like, "Hey, would you play us a song?" And you're like, "Oh, no, no, no. I can't do that sort of thing. My singing sucks." You're being unambitious in that respect. And you might also be being small-souled, but we got to ask, right? Is this about something big or is this about something minor? George says, I think I could think of someone who depends on their job. They should demand a larger wage, but they don't want to lose their job. Yeah, I mean, that's if you push too hard, right? That would be an issue. Oh, Nicole. Okay, so Nicole has a good point here. Seems in our culture, ambition developed as a negative association, as though it's equal to dominance and exploitation. The result is a tsunami of small souled people. Time to claim what we deserve. Yeah. And this is the challenge, right? To figure out, given that we've been given wrong assessments of value from perhaps people in our family, and it could be too high, too low, and then in school, and then in the workplace, and then in the general culture. How do we figure out what we really do deserve, and then how do we go about demanding it? Like George was pointing out, fear can stand in the way of demanding what we actually deserve. And I think you're right that there are a lot of people who are, we could, from Aristotelian point of view, small souled and don't have to be so, but they're kind of stuck in that. And we often talk in terms of like low self-esteem or stuff like that, but I think we can translate that into this question of ambition. On the other hand, there are other people that are pushed to be very ambitious and maybe go to too much of an extreme. If you are from a wealthy family or a family that has power, family, as we say, that has juice, has clout, you're probably going to be pushed to, assert yourself more than somebody who comes from the other side of the tracks, as we say, right? I, oh, so this is interesting. Nicole says assertiveness training seems to be great towards moving towards claiming that which you deserve. I think you're right about that. I mean, assertiveness training encompasses a bit more than that, right? Because like typically you distinguish between passivity, aggressivity, and then assertiveness. So like, if people are making you angry, you being assertive means like saying, I'm getting angry with you because you violated this boundary that I told you about. And, but I'm not going to like blow up and knock stuff off the desk, things like that. But it's also not like just tamping it down. So assertiveness training could be for anger. It could be for great souledness or right ambition. Would it pertain to any others? I think some of the ones that we're going to look at next week, because there's this virtue of like truthfulness or sincerity about the self. I think assertiveness training could probably help with that too, and also with the virtue of friendliness, because the virtue of friendliness requires us sometimes to lay down limits and say, I'm not going to do that with you. I'm not going to co-sign your BS to some people, and assertiveness is needed for that. So that's a great point. Oh, Nicole has a really great suggestion. An idea for the nameless middle, proper assertiveness. Yeah, that's a great idea. I like that. Um, that's something worth trying to get out there to the Aristotle people. As a matter